Imagine a family in a park living in a tent with their 6-month-old baby in the inner city on Christmas Eve after they've been evicted. They put up a small Christmas tree so that their young 6-month-old child won't miss out on their first Christmas. Or the parents with 2 children behind the garbage bins in a nearby cathedral listening to Christmas carols, trying to put their children to sleep. Or imagine an Indigenous woman who had a successful art career, who was now living in shop fronts, singing in her native language, grieving the loss of culture and connection to her family, and doing her art to sell to passers in exchange for cash. Or imagine an elderly gentleman with dementia of European descent who has a bag full of all his clothes and cash and walks into a church looking for a priest. Or a 17-year-old girl screaming with labour pains in a car park an hour before she was to give birth, hoping that someone would hear her. Or the woman in the boarding house who was sobbing only to be found by an outreach worker at an impromptu visit after she had been gang raped by 5 other residents. Or the man on the bus stop who was changing his colostomy bag only to find that he had none left. Or the woman arriving at Roma Street with 3 children, a broken arm, fleeing domestic violence from another state, only to find that there was no refuge with vacancies here. Or maybe you could imagine an outreach worker who was going out on their street work and found the person they were about to see had stopped breathing behind a bird cage near a hostel. He had died overnight. Or going down to the riverbank here at SouthBank, wondering why everyone was hovelled around in grief because their tent mate had been murdered. These are the realities of people who have been homeless in Brisbane. No 2 stories are the same, but they all ended up in homelessness. 20 years ago, my colleagues and I set up Micah Projects down the road, about a couple of blocks from here, with the support of a faith community. And that was the beginning of our journey of being involved in homelessness in the inner city of Brisbane. Brisbane at that time and on the streets was a very tense and conflictual place. There was conflict between the homeless people, businesses, residents, the police. Wherever you went, you'd be in the middle of some sort of conflict, whether it was politicians wanting some action or it was police and people being in conflict with each other. We wanted to do something because we were listening to people who we knew that with affordable housing disappearing because of prosperity and no hope of getting somewhere to live soon, that their frustration was growing. The numbers of people were growing all around this area, and we had hundreds of people living in tents on the streets. We knew from listening to people that their greatest desire was to live and love safely, to have a home, and to have their rightful place in community. We also knew of their anger and frustration because they could not access housing. The market wasn't going to give them the affordability that they could afford. We also witnessed their personal pain as their dignity became shame and vulnerability as their aspirations disappeared. So we were very motivated to find a solution and to do something different. Our first opportunity was here on this site when the construction company and Arts Queensland were going to build this beautiful building. There were people camping here that they knew had to be responded to. We were given some extra funding and we came down every day so that we could find who was here and know their circumstances and find a pathway out so they could get housing. Whilst we housed 140 people, we found that we were still going from crisis to crisis. If you just went round further on the river, there were another 100 tents and another crisis, and there were people under bridges, in squats all over the city. We wanted to find a way where we could be part of the solution and not just keep managing the problem. So a few outreach agencies, the police, housing providers got together, and Roseanne Haggerty was in town from New York, and she came to a forum and provided us with information about a project in LA which was designed to house 50 most vulnerable people on Skid Row. Spurred on by her challenge and the fact that we got some additional funding so that we now had a reliable street-to-home team that could work 7 days a week from 6 in the morning till 2 a.m. We decided to launch 50 Lives, 50 Homes for Brisbane, a campaign to house the first most vulnerable people off our streets. To do this campaign, we had to organise volunteers and do all the preparation that you do for any campaign. But the police came and worked with us, and we went out every morning at 4 o'clock till 6 o'clock on a particular week and surveyed the people who were living on our streets. For the first time, we had a systematic way of looking at who was here and what was the problem and what did we need to do about it. We had taken the risk to adopt and adapt a methodology that was evidence-based from another country. We had the data, so the purpose of that data was purely to house and support people. We had to take a new approach. First, we had to reframe how we saw homelessness, that it wasn't just to give housing to people who deserved it or who were ready for it, but that homelessness is a major public health issue that needs a housing response. People live on our streets at risk of dying. Of the 230 people that we surveyed that week, 51% had a high mortality risk, that is, at risk of dying. They had an average of 7.7 years of homelessness, and over the 3 years of the campaign, we surveyed 700 people and found that 55% were in treatment for mental health, 31% had previously had involuntary treatment orders, 77% had been in the watch house in the last 6 months, 32% had acquired brain injury, and many had trimorbid conditions. 50% had been victims of crime whilst they were homeless. 32% had been in our child protection system and in foster care. So we knew that we had to look at how we could make the change so that they could get into permanent housing. The approach we took was to know who was there, we had that data, and we had to look at how we were then going to get the supply of housing. The housing was short, we didn't know where the 50 homes were going to come from. But a small group of us were very involved in dreaming about the day that maybe we could bring a housing project to Brisbane, similar to that of Common Ground, New York. We had to get new partnerships. We got people to do financial modelling of what would it take to build a 10-storey building and have people with an environmental, sustainable building that was beautiful. And we never knew really that what was around the corner was that dream could become a reality. The outcome is that now, today, 146 people live just across the road there and look over at this cultural precinct in a beautifully designed building of 146 units. 50% are women, 76 people came straight from the street into that housing, and the others are low-income people. There's a multidisciplinary team on site with a clinical nurse. We knew that we had to organise things differently to the way we had in the past, and coordination with tenancy management that was also on site was critical. Also, from the 50 Lives campaign, the total number of people in the 3 years that we housed was 269, including the people at Brisbane Common Ground. We were relieved that the risk we had taken to try this methodology had worked. But what next? Have we ended homelessness in Brisbane? No, but we have for those people. We'd obviously build more housing if we had the money. We'd get government to reinvest in housing, healthcare and support services. And we'd make sure that we did it in a way that was going to be successful. Today we have 500 Lives, 500 Homes campaign, which went beyond just surveying people who were on the street. We surveyed families who were in cars, refuges across Brisbane, as well as individuals in boarding houses. We counted 532 children in that week who were homeless. We've reached our halfway mark. Maybe we set our target too low, is what the Americans tell us. And we know that solving our housing crisis, domestic violence, mental illness, unemployment and poverty are all interconnected. Homelessness can happen to any of us if our personal circumstances and our economic hardship collide. But we know that if we keep the status quo, inequality will only grow. We have to build communities that are inclusive and that treat people with dignity, that are accountable, and so that we are all safe and our well-being is achieved. Solutions to homelessness are possible, but they take more than the good works of individuals. Real change means that we have to create innovative systems where ordinary people can do extraordinary things. We know, as citizens, we know that we can build community and we can solve homelessness in Brisbane and Australia. Thank you.